to introduce an industry legend in Paul Mellender. We were just sort of talking offline, and I thought it'd be nice to do a bit of an introduction to Paul because he did a little short feedback session yesterday, which I thought was really cool. We wanted to take it to the next level and be able to do this live stream. So I thought it'd be a good opportunity for Paul to tell us a little bit about himself. He's very modest and he doesn't like to brag too much about what he's done in his past. But Paul, give us a spiel on your life.
Okay. Well, I'm an artist. I saved a child several times. That's not true. That saving a child part is a complete lie. I've been working in traditional art and film, video games, anything I can get my hands on since about the age of 3. I wasn't in film at 3. That was later. So over the last, 20 years or so, I've been working in various industries, everything from theater to film and advertising, illustration, VFX, anything really that popped up. So, yeah. And this evening, if anyone is so interested, I'd like to just run some conversations, and if anyone has paintovers they'd like me to work on or discuss art or consider portfolios or gossip about industry things, I'd be happy to jump in. So feel free to turn anything over that you'd like. And in the interim, waiting on questions or whatnot, and if it's okay with Alwyn, I'll do a little bit of drawing on the fly and then see how we go.
Yeah, awesome. Hey, just a bit of a, I guess, explanation about these sessions. What Paul is, very generous in his time and giving feedback to people or members of the rookies. So this is an opportunity for you to be able to, upload some work to Discord, to the general channel, which Paul can grab from there. I've just put a note in the chat. If you'd like to get some basic feedback, he did an amazing sort of draw over yesterday, giving some feedback to some person, which was fantastic. So, make the most of it. Paul's time is very valuable. So this is an opportunity for you to get some, really sound feedback. So Paul's got some stuff that he's going to work on today until we get some questions or get some artwork uploaded to that channel, and he'll pick it up from there. I'll let him know when somebody's uploaded something. So I'll hand it over to you, Paul, and thanks a lot, mate. We'll talk soon.
My pleasure. Thank you. Put me on mute for a little bit. Please feel free to turn on your preferred music.
Do you want to talk us through what you're doing here, Paul?
Sure. This is an initial sketch I did a while back. So with the image I'm doing here, I have some pet projects I keep in the background, and at this time of year, I set about reworking, completing, and re-examining illustrations I've done for A Christmas Carol. And right now I'm going through one of the sketches I had put in the background a while back. And there are parts that I do not like. It was just a quick 15, 20-minute throw together. The parts I'm looking at that I'm going to be switching up are one, the facial features, how the lighting on the face goes. But also the proportioning, I'm going to be changing his pose, altering the lighting, and some of how languid he is and how he stands. And go from there, basically. Just try to do an initial cleanup of area so that I'm working with a minimum of chaos, and also focusing where I'm going to be working. So I'm going to first close in on the eyes and try to get some information there. For the sketches, I actually go into a destructive phase. I go into break sketches. I usually consider sketches the first idea, worst idea. And they're actually a good counterpoint to try to make better decisions. So grabbing this guy right now to see what I can come up with in terms of what I didn't like as opposed to what worked.
And so what was the inspiration behind these, Paul?
When I first started as a professional artist, I wanted to be an illustrator in kind of in a way that illustrators don't really appear so much anymore. And I used to, I might be a bibliophile. I might have an issue of reading and collecting books. And when I set about this one, there were a number of books that I wanted to do some definitive illustrations for, illustrations that I thought could, one, capture my sense of interest and wonder when I first heard the story, but if possible, also try to capture some of the intuitive metaphors of the writing itself. So The Lord of the Rings was one book. A Christmas Carol was another. And I'm not necessarily a fan of Charles Dickens or, just randomly pointing at literature. But what I remember, I loved the story when I was a kid. I loved the evocative imagery. I liked the frightening elements as well as some of the descriptives and the general mood. So it's always been one that I've it's nagged at me to continue and try to pursue, if I never even get there, just to see some of the images from these works.
Yeah, awesome. And how long have you been working on this for?
The original group, I remember I did in 2000, I think, something like that. And I've been reworking them every year since. So they're kind of a project with a life all their own. I change them every year. So I tend to, where a thing I run into with a lot of young artists is trying to figure out when to stop or when to quit or when a picture is done. And I'm probably the worst person to ask that because I don't think they're ever done. I think in a sense we're trying to manifest things into reality, and however long that takes is however long it takes. When doing like commercial art, when you're making a product for someone, basically making a set of images with some set constraints, it has a little bit easier way of trying to figure out when a piece is done, because at the start you can define the criteria and the endpoints that will meet the needs of a client. But for myself, I'm always going to be behind. I'm never going to be ahead of where I want to be. Whereas with clients, we're often far ahead in skill and conception than our clients will ever be. So you can say, okay, here's the portion I can turn over to a commercial work. However, my own work, I look at and go, yeah, we'll see next year. We'll get a little closer to life next year. It'll eventually hit a point where it'll have a little more impact than actual reality, and that's when it'll have worked. I've never achieved that yet, but pretty sure it's coming. It's got to be on the way now.
There's always next year.
Yeah, it'll be fine. one of the things of the previous version, um, having the darker eyes, I didn't feel he was especially ethereal enough. I want him to almost not be present. So the more things that don't have substance will read more like there's almost that his identity is Gossamer. The less information we can get from clear shapes and what we would expect from objects will make them a bit uncanny. One of the other things I like to do in an image at an early stage like this is set the bony landmarks and make sure that their angles are giving a subtle but strong definitive signal to where the attention of the character is paid. So that because we do tend to read certain types of landmarks, highlight landmarks often, as guides and compasses for attention. And so one of the things I like to try to do at an early stage is make sure that I've got my compasses pointing in the right way so that as I work later on, because they're large objects on the face, I don't have to do tons of rework at a far point later on. I tend to work without models and reference, so in a number of ways, I'm figuring my way out as I'm going, and expecting that some of the images and patterns that I'm seeing as I'm working are going to provide clarity in some of the direction.
In terms of your understanding of anatomy, Paul, like what level did you go to to fully understand the structural, I guess, integrity of of your drawings?
I started studying anatomy when I was 8. My mom's an artist, and she had anatomy books around, and I liked superheroes, so I wanted to draw muscle men. But very quickly I started to notice, like when I see advice for anatomy books, I never feel like they're quite hitting the mark. There's the parts that they aim at are structural categories, like here's the skeletal system, muscular system, fascia, tendons, things like that, fat areas. How we experience anatomy is a mix of things. It isn't just what we know by look. So we partially read and understand anatomy by our own actions in space, how we navigate space. Also by how our eyes travel across other people. The saccadic movement of our eyes when we're examining and looking at someone, how our eyes hit fixation points and jump, and how those points coordinate to the experience of vision. Our anatomy, when we make it, like when we look at it mechanically and like through physics, like what is it that, the shin bone's connected to the knee bone. When we look at it in terms of that type of thinking, we tend to try to think of measures or categories. But part of anatomy is understanding those parts, like what's mechanically connected, what are the dependencies, like fat dependent on the motion of muscles and attachment points. But also, how is it that humans see anatomy and what don't they see in anatomy? What are the beacon points? So when I first started studying anatomy, I was trying to be as accurate and physically and geometrically spot on as I could. But I found that it did not relate to adding character. It just was satisfying an impulse to be correct by a standard that isn't experience. So knowing that we look at these things medically and mechanically, there's an impulse to want to achieve according to the standards of an occupation that isn't art. But as artists, we do things experientially. We're building experiences for people to ride and wear. So, studying anatomy, knowing which pieces connected where, angles, was one part, but then understanding the parts of anatomy that in, are involved with our own mechanosensory system, parapersonal space, which is things like if you wear a tall hat and you duck under a doorway because you feel the hat, you feel the extra space of your hat, that's parapersonal space. Like the ability to use a hammer or a pen is because our brain extends out to extra anatomies. And we have to alter the way we understand balance and perceive balance. So it went from trying to study anatomy in the ways that you can find in books to then trying to understand anatomy in terms of human experience, because we read anatomy very differently than we chart it, than we measure it. So what I do is oftentimes my anatomy will be very wrong in terms of the physics or pieces going together, but correct in terms of your eyes tracking and then the coordinated time spent on your eyes tracking and how your brain composites that tracked information into what you understand a body is doing. So it's for me, I think studying is good, but also studying how our eyes work, studying how we perceive anatomy. Like people often aren't even aware of sections of anatomy that they can set their eyes on and look at, but not realize they're seeing it all. They're blind to it. So for artists, I think it's important to be aware of those things and see what everyone sees, but also see what no one sees, and be able to put all of those in the picture. Because even though people aren't aware they aren't seeing it, you're experiencing it.
Yeah, I think when I hear that, it's almost like 3D in terms of that. When somebody first does 3D, it's really that they make it so perfect that it looks 3D, right? And you actually need to then go back and add those imperfections and those subtleties to actually make it look like it's more in the real world. And I think it's a similar thing to what you're talking about there. It's like knowing how to do the 3D is the first step. The biggest step is actually knowing how to bring it into the real world.
Well, and I think like what we were talking about earlier, kind of the hierarchy of needs in a drawing or in a picture. It's like the learning the 3D is great. It's an achievement for an artist to be able to take steps to make an experience of vision. But the experience of vision is going to have very different properties than that achievement. So it's like one of the things I saw a tutorial on it a few years ago, and it was talking about doing the asymmetry of a face. And it's like, make sure faces are, because no face is symmetrical, make sure you add asymmetry. But it's more complicated than that. There's rules to asymmetry, and there's like this myth that beautiful faces are more symmetrical, and that's not the case at all. Our faces are asymmetrical because the way we move our eyes and the way that our peripheral vision, which picks up things like motion detection, as opposed to our fovea, which picks up like the detail and the color information, they're happening at the same time. So as we look at a face, we parcel it up. Like the way we tend to look at things is we'll often like focus here, our eyes will go here, we'll go to here, use the nose as like a type of compass for attention. and we'll travel back and forth over time. And this eye is not going to have the same facial expression as this eye when we get to discerning these things. Faces are going to be made up of multiple expressions when we understand them as a vision. But when we focus on this eye, when we initially take in the look of this eye, we are seeing the motion and twitches to confirm what we're seeing here in our peripheral vision. So even though we're looking here, we're getting information here that confirms and changes what we're understanding of a face. So our faces are asymmetrical, so that the side that we bias on to get our first pass of information and then to have the sequence of information unfold is uneven. They give two different stories. One has to do with motion more, one has to do with color, size, and things like that. Over time, as we coordinate all these moving parts and they turn into an experience, that is then when we can go and pause and go, hey, faces aren't even. It's like, well, okay, in measure, they're not even, but in terms of information supply and sequence, they are even and they're in good sequence, which is why we don't usually notice unless we're measuring how distorted people's faces are in terms of snapshot. People's faces aren't snapshot, they exist in time. And so it's like in any picture I do, like this face, for example, I'm trying to put in multiple facial expressions over a period of time so that it works like a face. I know that the viewer's eye is going to be traveling over quite a long time, this piece. So I want to make sure that the corner of this eye and the corner of this eye aren't the same. They're a few seconds offset from one another. That events are happening, that the character themselves are in play in their own time and space.
Yeah, wow.
So things like that, knowing anatomical things like along those lines is just as helpful as knowing the mechanical anatomy. Is that the longest way around of answering your question ever? Jesus, sorry.
That's fascinating stuff.
Holy cow. Ask me the time I tell you how to make a watch. Jesus. Should work for that. Alan, did anybody have any questions, or are they still trying to figure out what I said a minute ago?
I think they're still digesting all the information that you said before, but no, nothing coming through yet. We just
No worries.
I'm tracking it. So do you want to just, while you're doing that, Paul, just tell us a little bit about the types of work that you're doing at the moment? Like, are you, is it sort of all big film stuff? Is it commercial stuff like TVC? Is it,
Yeah, the stuff I've been working on recently, finished up some stuff with some video games. Did some work with Zoic on the Midnight Mass show that's, I think, streaming at the moment. And been doing a lot of creature concept, a bit of costume design. That's something that I don't work on as much, but I used to. I used to do that and some of that in theater stuff a long time ago. Last year, or 2 years ago, I got a chance to do some design for some actual makeup effects, which I hadn't done. And I used to, when I first started and was first interested in doing any type of film or anything as a young man, it was doing practical effects and doing latex and makeup design. And so that was like kind of a throwback that I hadn't actually worked on in quite some time. So that was pretty fun. But yeah, so mostly stuff right now has been concept, illustration things, a lot of pitch dev, um, getting initial ideas over into pitch documents. Some new forms of concept art, like on the fly concept art in actual meetings, like trying to sort out quick information on the fly has been a thing that's been coming up quite a bit. Worked on some of that with some mech and robot design and so on recently. But yeah, mostly film stuff right now. I'm in large part trying to take a bit of a break from video games. I've always had a bit of a suspicious eye and variable experiences working in video games. The culture and some of the non-work parts of video games, the non-actual labors of it, I sometimes don't find so savory. So I'm taking a bit of a break from video games at the moment and hoping and watching pretty closely to see how culture shifts are going.
Interesting. And in terms of the type of work that you do for video games and for big films, is it very similar, Paul? Like, is the deadlines the same? Are the clients got the same sort of requests? Is it vastly different?
I found film is much more straightforward. They should be similar. They have a lot in common. In video games, there's a lot of corporate folklore and discussion. Not in all of them, obviously. Each studios have their own objectives and priorities and whatnot. But many of them I've worked with should be using much more movie tactics. One, because the technology is up to it, the art skills are up to it. A number of the things are already invented, so wheels don't need to be reinvented there. For art things, they are very similar, and especially with things like all of the game engines now, as they're jumping forward and crossing the boundaries between theater film quality and what can be done real time, those lines are blurring. From my point of view, they've been blurring for quite a long time now, and the boundary should have been pushed long ago. I don't think that even the technological constraints that are often mentioned are as costly and impossible, that you wouldn't want to do them, or that they're not worthwhile. So I think between like video games and film, I think should have much more cross collaboration. Oftentimes when I'm like doing art direction for games or any role, concept art, or even doing modeling, I always bring in film and film production quality standards and practices into it, because they oftentimes go right over where you have to make accommodations. You can usually sort that out. So I don't know that the two are that dissimilar. I do know that in video games it's much more reactionary as you cross disciplines. Like oftentimes engineering will be very, not even conservative, reactionary. Like a number of studios I've worked with in the not distant past have operated it with technological standards and practices that are 15 years old, but yet portrayed them as if they're up to the minute. And it's like there were actually struggles to go, hey, this isn't the case. In fact, the way we're doing this is more costly, tech-wise, is more costly in terms of processing power, just because the way the technology has shifted. So I'd have to say that they're getting closer and closer. And as far as artists go, I'd always say push that boundary anyway. I mean, I am a big fan of not being obedient to industry standards, because industry standards are not necessarily the high standard. They're just a conventional standard. And oftentimes, where artists want to push boundaries, that's where invention is often found. So, even if, like, you're working in a game studio and you want to push and extend or challenge boundaries, I always tell everybody to set up a proof of concept R&D project and go for it, because oftentimes people's fears and expectations don't equal out to what can actually be done, and higher levels of quality. Again, did that answer the question okay?
Thoroughly. Yeah, no, it was good. So in terms of just, I guess, in terms of young people trying to get in now, Paul, obviously you've been in, a veteran in the industry, and, if you were to give advice to young people trying to get in, and, like what would you be telling them, like, to focus on, and, is there little nuggets that you can share with us today?
They might be a bit controversial. I sometimes, my opinions are not necessarily shared by, I have a friend of mine, Bart McCoy, who introduced me to another artist, and he introduced me saying, Paul, he's an artist also, nobody agrees with him. and, and he's very right in a lot of ways. My thoughts are, one, don't chase after the common banner. It's what you've heard is always late, and what anyone is asking you to make isn't necessarily what's wanted. So, like, trying to chase after, one of the ones I've heard a lot of, and to a lot of, is portfolio reviews. And the portfolio reviews are obedient in advance. They're trying to meet the wants of an unknown hiring manager. And I've been a hiring manager, and I've known hiring managers of various sorts and competences. And I'm not sure we should be trusted with that information as is. I've been caught by surprise by people who've done extraordinary work. It's been private work sometimes. And hopefully, as a hiring manager, we're looking at things somewhat analytically and saying, this thing is extraordinary. This would help. I'm not even sure how somebody did this. Let's talk. Let's figure out how to best grab the most extraordinary pieces, most extraordinary artists, and work with them where possible. That's not always the case. Oftentimes, hiring managers and studio environments can be very political. They can be petty. There are hiring managers I know of, art directors, art managers, who don't have art background at all, but won't hesitate to ridicule an artist's work in front of their staff, not promptly reply to artist resumes, things like that, resumes and portfolios, not even bother to look through them. It's something I've run into myself, where it's like, you go in to have someone review your portfolio, and they haven't even bothered to look at all of it or any of it. So I think it's a better idea to understand what it is that has come before, and what needs are pressing studios of various sorts, film, games, whatever area your art's aiming. But also, don't look at appeasing it, look for exceeding it. Be more than the thing that anyone is asking for. In a number of cases, the people looking at the work are themselves out of date. A practice I often suggest to young artists is when somebody asks to see your portfolio for hire, ask to see their portfolio as well, so that you can get a good gauge of the person making judgments about you. If you can look at their work and your technical skills and expertise surpass the person who's looking at your work, that may be a warning sign. There may be things going on that don't have to do with technical skill, merit in your work. There may be other objectives that might be a complication to a career of an artist. So I would suggest for young artists that don't approach with your hat in your hands. One of the things that I think is a lacking thing in any educational forum for artists is teaching how to guard dignity and guard your work. There's often talk about being submissive to critique. There's very little talk about rejecting inappropriate critique. I myself am not a big fan of critique. I see other methods that work better, like, for example, paint overs or drawing with. If you're drawing with an artist who's asked you for advice or wants input, you have to invest your time and skills. You have to try to step in their shoes, and you're both trying to achieve an end. You aren't looking to dismantle, point out flaws, and otherwise vandalize work. Like even the word criteria, crit, means to pull apart or to tear apart. It's a destructive method. Whereas if you're additively putting your hands on, one of the great advantages of digital work, doing a paint over, trying to analyze, figure out, and discussing with an artist, they'll go much further. One of the aspects of critique that I find an interesting thing is it bears a parallel to psychological warfare and trying to induce depressive tactics like ruminating, thinking over your past mistakes over and over again and trying to fix them, relive them, and appease somebody else's sense of taste, as if that sense of taste has some prestige. So I think there's a number of ways that young artists would be served in learning how to at once be humble and try to get a good sense of their skills and abilities, but also how to guard their good work, keep it from vandalism, know how to discern and start to pick out highly political environments versus highly collaborative environments. So my first piece of advice to young artists would be hone your skills as far as is possible for where you are looking to be. That means that you have to, in the background, take real time and start planning and considering what it is you want to do, how to get there, what the standards might be. Find artists who you admire their work and approach them courteously and see if you can get respectful in both directions information, a good conversation, that they can offer you good advice or helpful advice, and so on. It's, I think, in a lot of ways, the way young artists have been trained, they're trained to be highly imitative, and they're also trained to suppress their own dignities and sense of pride in their work. Okay. Let's see. Looks like we've got an image. I'll grab that. Was that especially controversial?
No, it's a great perspective on it. Honestly, like I think, there's your stock standard sort of answers, and I think it's always refreshing to hear it from a different angle. I think they're all really relevant points, and there was somebody that just even in the chat said they're all great points. I think there's a lot of stuff that we can be doing to protect our work, and like you said, some of feedback can be very destructive and very I think as a young person hard to come back from when you're getting critiqued like that, right?
Well, and I think there's also, like, when I try to run things where we're doing what people often mistake for critiques, where we're doing a collaboration to come to solutions. I try to guide those as much as possible and say, okay, here is the objective. Here's where we're at. Here's some points that may be of concern. Let's look at these guys, try variations, put our hands on it, not go, I don't like this, or I do like this. Like doesn't get to play a part, especially for like commercial art where we might not like the work that we're doing, but we're trying to make it the best thing possible. And that means that we have to look at actual properties and the objective of the overarching project and try to put those together. Rarely have I seen critiques that do that. I've seen dailies where that comes up. I've seen things where people are actually looking to piece together information, but I haven't really seen them in critiques. In a number of the companies I've worked for, there have been special times for the artists to get together and like do an art show once a week or once every couple of weeks to show their work to each other. And more often than not, I've seen those highly competitive and destructive. It's almost an exercise to see if you can tear somebody else's work down.
Yeah, it's great comment there from Lasco, who's just saying there that he got heavily critiqued on when he was doing some artwork, and it almost made him stop. So
yeah, and I think that's extremely common. The other thing is it trains you, if you don't want to stop, it trains you to subvert your own opinions and just blindly accept and passively accept. And more often than not, like I can get grumpy, I found with people, even clients, and I will tell them, it's like, hey, why don't I handle the art part? I'm glad to hear your thoughts. However, you don't know what you're talking about, which is why I'm here. If I need further information, I'll come and ask you. And the way I'll ask you will have to do directly with the work. Not, hey, let's have a free for all of ideas. I mean, I don't think people go to brain surgeons and go, I was thinking you should mess around with a couple of these wiry parts. Doesn't happen because people have a sense of respect for their expertise, and it isn't considered it's subjective, and subjective equals random opinion. It doesn't. Subjective is real tricky business. And like, for example, if a mass of people share a subjective experience, are we still talking about something subjective? We can look at it and we can say they're sharing what amounts to, on average, the same thing. Their replies, their responses, pretty much the same. That's not really what we would consider random individual subjective ideas anymore. And that is something that art runs into. Okay. Let me see what we got here. All right. So I'm going to grab a couple of these images. Okay. And we've got a few. Okay, let me take just a second and grab these. Okay. And for the posters who put them up, can I ask that you give me a little bit of background on your objective with it, what it is, either the story you're looking for, if it was a study that you were trying to do, what were the objectives of the study? And that way I can kind of aim some of the ideas and directions I'd head while looking at these guys. So was that Code Tech Ninja, I believe, sent the space station one.
Yeah, Code Tech Ninja, it would be awesome if you could just write in the chat exactly. Just give Paul some context about your image. What did you want to know, Paul?
A couple of objectives. If it's a narrative piece, what was the narrative? If it's a study, like a material study, what was some of the thinking or objective areas that were being studied and you'd like me to look at? or if it's a mix of all of the above, I can give a general overview.
Yeah, there he goes. He just answered. He said this project was for the Abandoned Space Station Challenge by CG Boost. Okay, well, not giving too much information there, but yeah,
Okay.
maybe.
My guess is if it's a challenge, it has probably all parts in it put together. A couple of thoughts is points of emphasis on this guy. We are like, for an image like this, if it is an abandoned space station or a ruined space station, the storytelling part would be what indicates it's abandoned as opposed to like a well-worn space station. Where are the places where habitation might be? So when you think of an abandoned building, for example, one of the things about an abandoned building is that it has areas where people fit. And if those areas are in disrepair, as opposed to, just wear and tear, they are not as fitting for a person anymore. There's problems that are like dangerous floors or beams in the way. So with an abandoned space station, it almost becomes a character in itself. So looking at it in terms of it's abandoned. Where is the hero part of the space station you'd like to look at? Would that be like an area where, what's that little info? Just grab here. Are there areas where there are habitation or signs that the ship itself is running on autopilot? Maybe kind of reddish lights that maybe don't burn out as fast, so that they can be emergency lighting. Things along those lines. And for this, like, one of the things I would try to do here, almost like the light panels up here, is try to give areas showing that there is nothing there. That areas that should have population signs are in disrepair and not in good use. Sorry about that. So, in terms of that, because we have the space station set up as a central thing at almost a 3/4 angle, if we try to think of this as a character or a personified thing, and we think of this as a head, okay, with the type of lighting we have here, and we might want to think of it in terms of like, what are the directions, what are their and the affinities are, one, it's got mirrored sides. It's similar in its two-sided shapes. What is it we want this thing to be paying attention to? There's a property that has to do with how we invest and project agency into objects. I'll show it to you real quick, and we'll take a quick look at how we can use it here. Okay, so there's two figures. And anyone who knows me knows I go over this all the time. One is called Kiki, and one is called Booba. Let's just do Kiki. These two shapes you can automatically discern information about. If I say to you, one of them is sweet and one of them is spicy, one of them is called Kiki, one of them is called Booba, one of them is male, one of them is female, one of them is old, one of them is young. You'll be able to make determinations on these. There's no definitive answer for these. There's a statistical majority for how people divvy these up, but there's not a right answer. And that's because when we look at objects, we tend to start to project agency with curve, line, corner, and intersection information. So when people talk about line work, some of this is what they're talking about. We can hear, we have actually cross-modal signatures for points and round areas. We also have we have maps on the surface of our brain and the direction of our eyes. So when we're determining areas of things, we're also taking and considering how these things match up to the map of our own body we have on our brain. It does not at all look like this in proportion. If you want to look it up, it's called the homunculus. And look up cortical maps in the homunculus, and you'll see how our brain is actually divvying up the space of our body. However, when we're looking at lines, we are triggering where and how we're understanding space on a body map. And we're able to start investing shapes as simple as these with character. We're starting to agent them. They'll start to take on personalities, and we will invest in them. So in a spaceship like this, for example, we'll be looking at these shapes and trying to, one, look at individual parts, but also look at the thing overall and consider it as a body, a hero, a protagonist. So for a piece like this, if we're looking at it and we want to consider it abandoned, we can look at it at this distance. And so take what I'm saying next as suggestions or basically riffing, as opposed to like, here's a good idea. These are just thoughts as I'm looking at it. I would have taken this from a different point of view to try to give over some of the perspective of the ship. So if, of course, I didn't prepare for that. Let's do this. So if I were going to take the ship, I would try to do it so that its distance in space is meaningful to the viewer, so that it's out of their eye range. So oftentimes, if you think of a hero and a villain, if you're a first person and you're the implied hero in a picture, and the artist has drawn a monster, and the monster is taking up this area, you don't want the monster to be easily seen at a distance. That's product placement. You want it to go outside of the frame, because it takes a bit for a person seeing something intimidating or grand and vast. Those fall out of where our eyes are at any particular easy reach moment trying to discern. So going outside the frame, one, helps give over the sense of a space station, vastness in space itself. And then some of the other character objects like the planets and whatnot can be back here. With this type of perspective, like if you think of it as like a lens with like 18 millimeter focal length, something comic booky, you'll be able to see some of the interior pieces and target details that will indicate humans were there, that as a viewer we can recognize, look at, and understand, oh, that's a bay where where shuttles would have launched. It's empty, it's barren, or there's even a ruined one with smoke inside. So showing some of the information that would be personal to somebody who's actually looking to land on or interact with the space station would be a way I would approach it. Try to give over, even if it blocks the good craftsmanship of the object that you've made, sacrificing those pieces for the sake of the story and the narrative, turning over to the audience so they can inhabit the scene and understand depth as grandness, abandonment, danger in the decay or dilapidation, that type of thing. Was that at all helpful? And I know it might take a few seconds to reply. Okay. Let me grab the next one. I think we had a bison one. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. I think I'm a little bit behind on some of the chat here. Let me take a look here real quick.
Yeah, maybe Jessica, if you're in the chat, just put down some context for Paul as well with the bison.
What were your thoughts on that, Alvin? What did you think of the ship ideas I was putting forward?
Yeah, you know what?
Let me know if I'm off.
I actually, when you were doing the sketch, that whole, because I think, I'm thinking back to even when I sort of was studying art stuff, like everything, you'd never go outside of the frame, right? But actually, when you did, that concept of it being enormous and grand, actually, it actually did fit with moving outside of the frame. It just gives that sense of scale. So I actually really like that. If I'm looking at this piece personally, like there's it's too dark. You're losing a lot of detail in some of the side areas there. And I know it's still early stages, and I think his aim is to create a 3D render to showcase as a space station that has been abandoned. So I don't know. I think at the moment it's a bit, even the angles, right? And you're the art expert, Paul, but when we're looking at angles, it's all very predictable. I think you could have a lot more interesting angles happening with it in terms of that spaceship rolling in.
Mentioning that, I think there's also a thing with this that they use in news shows and television angles. If you want somebody to be seen as short or thought of as short, you set the camera up at a high angle and you angle it down on them. And if you want them to appear grand, you do an up angle, because you're basically you're shortifying or tallifying the audience. And people feel automatic condescension. Like there was a VR test that was done where they had a guy in a VR headset interacting with, he took an ethics test before the session, was in VR for a bit, interacting with people much shorter than he is, like he was twice as tall. And he started to take on like bullying tactics. And when they gave him the ethics test after the session, he did a terrible job because we intuitively, and this is an old Renaissance painting trick, you hyper adultify, or you put the audience in a position where they basically are on their knees or are submissive to whoever's in the portrait. And in a thing where like coming down on a ship like we are at this angle here, we're taller than it. We're taller than the ship is. Whereas a ship, you might want to think of it like seeing it from a grand angle, like you're coming up underneath and you're trying to take it all in. So sorry, I didn't mean to step on the question I asked you there, but it struck an idea.
No, that's cool. And there's just a question in the chat here from Tootsie Pop. Said, I wanted to know if it's a good idea to present creatures concept for a game in development in this way. I guess we're talking about the one that we're looking at on screen, or should it be presented in a more dynamic pose?
I don't know there's a set answer to that. I find two different things with that. I find people are preparing to have things examined as 3D. Like if we think of a full pipeline in a game development thing for a character and some of the decision making that has to go into it. There are traditional ways of presenting things where people like to get a look and feel like they're being given an official document that has the way that you present concept art. That doesn't necessarily work, and the people looking at it they aren't using it analytically. They'll look at it and they'll make some commentary and they'll go with the convention. So, like when I do concept art for a thing like this, from doing a creature concept, if it's a concept, I don't presume I'm throwing it over to 3D yet. And I don't presume I'm prepping it over for height and measurement. For some of the concept things, the thing I want to do is take each characteristic. So if I've made a creature of some sort and I've altered him to have different arms, it isn't just different arms, it's different posture. Arms are going to influence everything. So for each unique piece, each unique feature, the evolutionary feature I want to put in the character, I make a sketch hero piece. When it comes time to have the discussion with 3D artists, animators, riggers, things like that, I will then, after it's gotten some initial approvals based on the intent of the concept is meant to present the interesting pieces. Then I'll do a restrained thing that has criteria from the following departments with their consultation and advice. So like if it's just you though as a concept artist, what I tend to do, unless somebody's asked me otherwise, is I hero the pieces, because the concept isn't necessarily to make 5 different arms that are stuck on the same guy as if 5 different arms don't have an effect. I sometimes will fight back against that and go, wait, if his arms are like this and the animator has to make this look real, this is not going to be an ideal thing where he's got the same stance, just 5 different arms. We have to characterize the differences in the concepts. So I would expect that there are, depending on the information you're trying to get across, I think it's one of the hard pieces with describing anything as concept or any of the random terms they use to describe art pieces. What is the intent? Where is this going? If you want to get over a piece that is selling an idea, you might want to add a hero piece. If you're doing a piece that has to fit into constraints that are already sorted out in a development pipeline that you can't move too far from, you may be stuck doing cosmetic variations, paper dolling, basically. So it does depend a bit. Given my choice, though, just jumping in, I always jump in with the hero piece that's just going to be a cohesive piece of artwork in itself, where I can determine weight, balances, heroism, what makes it an exciting thing to look at versus just yeah, he's got long arms. Long arms are good. It's like those long arms are, geez, they both have pluses and minuses. They get the imagination working. Did that answer the question okay? It answered the question by not answering it. Do whatever you want. But
yeah,
that pretty much.
It was actually Jessica that asked that question. So this is her artwork. So I guess she's just trying to work out the best way to present her work. And I think you're right. There's probably two different options there. I think as a student, you probably there's one way of showcasing your skills and your skill set through presenting this way, making sure you're showing off you got proportions and stuff correct. And then there's what you're talking about, Paul, which is actually doing the hero, I guess, concept piece for it in action.
Mm-hmm. I would ask, if it is for like a student piece, sorting out the criteria of what you're making at the start is always super important. And sometimes, like for a thing like this, you will get that information at the start. Like, we're going to need basically a paper doll thing. We're going to need it. It has to stick within such and such a range. So for a piece like this, if it is a thing where you're trying to show you can stay within constraints and proportions, the next question would then be, what are the things you're featuring and how good is the clarity? Like, for example, showing a rough sketch in proportion to show scale. You might want to show, like, okay, what is the, and I think there's a number of artists who I see post on various forums that actually go into the, once they have a thing like this, they'll do a line work anatomy piece of it, trying to show, give over a sense of, one, its anatomy, but also its evolutionary and later even rigging and muscle stuff, depending on how it's going to flow, what part of the pipeline is being delivered to. They'll give over that information as part of this package too. So I do think presenting it like this, if the constraints demand it, is a completely viable way. It's just, I think, depending on the constraints that you're asked for or how much freedom you're given. I think that may have been the answer.
Sounds good, mate. We're just, what are we over? We're an hour 10, Paul. So I'm not too sure if you want to, mate. You've put in a good session. If you wanted to wrap it there, and we can pick up some of the other artwork in the next session.
That sounds fantastic.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks for jumping on, Paul. I don't know if you wanted to say a few words just as we finish up.
Sure. One, thanks everybody who's joined in, and feel free to contact me through the Rookies Discord with questions, or through my website and email, paul@paulmellender.com, or any of the other forums where you may happen to catch me. I'll try to get back to you in a reasonable time if I don't come on back, and I'm going to be doing a few of these sessions on Tuesdays and Thursdays, if that's all right with Alwyn.
Oh, and, absolutely, man. We love having you on board, so no problem.
Oh, excellent. And we'll go over those then and see what we can come up with. Awesome. So thanks for participating with me and listening to me talk.
Thanks, Paul. We'll catch you on Tuesday next week. Have a good weekend, mate.
All right. My pleasure. Take care.
Hey, buddy.